This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and normally various guests. But actually today I'm on my own because I really felt I wanted to explain how we put together our bulb range every autumn and a bit about the process, but also for me to pick my 12 desert island bulbs for planting at this time of year. And I guess it's because I know that as a busy person, if I can get a filter that I trust and has some authority based on experience, for instance, in a recipe book or in a gardening book, when I started out, it was Christopher Lloyd, for instance, but it just means so much, I think. I love learning, and I love learning from people with experience. And I think I can claim that about growing bulbs. And so I thought on my own, I would just sit quietly yesterday and select the 12 things for planting at this time of year that are bulbs that, as I say, I would really miss if I didn't have them. I suppose also that there's things they have in common, perhaps, are that they don't necessarily draw attention to themselves. And there are so many things out there that you can plant, whether it's tulips or narcissus or alliums or whatever. This is just the pick of the pick in my view, and totally only in my view. So I want to start with a tulip called Dom Pedro. And most of these bulbs I'm going to talk about have little stories attached to them. And Dom Pedro is, to me, one of the most glamorous tulips in the world, partly because of what it looks like, which is a rich crimson mahogany. And it definitely has a touch of mahogany in it. So it's not just like Queen of Night or whatever. It's got a real chestnut richness to it, which I absolutely adore and makes it stellar in my eyes. So it's unusual in itself, but also it has such a nice story, which is that it's part of what's called the breeder group. And there is a place in Holland, quite near Schiphol Airport, in Liesel. No, not Liesel, Lisa, got that wrong, which is called Hortus barborum. And what this is, and I think I might have talked about this place on the podcast in the past, but I definitely think it merits talking about again, which is that it's a living museum of bulbs. And what that means is that basically you can't, as you can with seed, sort of freeze them and keep them as living organisms because that would kill them. So you have to store them cool and dry, and then every so often you need to grow them out to maintain stock that has the potential to grow. And Hortus barborum basically does a selection of every bulb, as far as I know it, that has ever been grown. They will have some genetic material, some bulbs of it. And a small proportion is grown out every year. And the breeder group are incredibly important. One, because they're very glamorous, because they've got this rich chocolate colouring on the whole, but also two, because they were called the breeder group because they were known to be quite big, quick bulker-uppers to form bulblets quite quickly. And so they were used as the breeders, crossed with different colours and stuff. So they were used as a sort of almost a genetic bank. And I remember walking into Hortus barborum probably 20 years ago now with Jonathan Buckley, maybe 15, maybe 20. And each time I've been, different flowers are at their peak. One year, the Iris reticulatus were incredible. The next year, because we were early, the next year, the hyacinths were incredible because we were in March. And the next year, in late March, the Narcissus were incredible. But this particular time, we'd gone later than usual, and it was mid-April. And the breeder tulips, line on line on line, were just absolutely breathtaking. And I remember I was allowed to pick one head of each, and I laid them on a rusty old door on the side of the site, and we took a photograph. And it's been my sort of go-to inspiration for tulip combinations and collections kind of ever since, really. Anyway, Dom Pedro was one of those. And every spring we go to Holland, the Horti team, and we travel kind of the width and breadth, really, of the Netherlands, visiting breeders that we know have this similar eye to us and that like similar types of bulbs to us. And on our trip this April, we were taken by one of our suppliers to a breeder who'd bred out Dom Pedro. And it was so exciting. It was a hideous day. It was hailing and blowing a gale, but out we got and to be surrounded by this beautiful bulb. And so we have very little of it available this year, but at least a little. And it's not in the catalogue because we've got so little of it. But I really recommend, if you want something absolutely exotic, glamorous, and unusual to grow in a pot, probably on your doorstep, because it's quite expensive, I would really recommend Tulip Don Pedro. Anyway, I promise I won't wax quite as lyrical and as long about all of them. But the next one that I wanted to talk about is Narcissus Starlight Sensation. And I have mentioned this before, but I have to put this in one of my 12 desert island bulbs because it flowers for ages, into months rather than weeks, which is very, very unusual, but increasingly usual with newly bred hybrid Narcissus. And that's the thing, hybridization, in a way, with some of us, particularly more sort of garden snobs, is associated with coarsening of beautiful, delicate species things. But I promise you that isn't true by any means in all cases. Narcissus Starlight Sensation is very long flowering. It's very perfumed. It has up to 7 or 8 flowers at the top of every stem. So you only need, let's say 15 bulbs for quite a whopper pot, and you've got something pretty sensational. And so for a window box, for a balcony, I couldn't recommend anything more strongly. Flowering from the middle of March to the end of April, and it's just an absolute corker. And just sometimes, I've got my tried and tested favorite bulbs, but sometimes a new one comes along and just knocks you off your perch of sort of thinking, oh, okay, that's gone to my number 2, really. That's got to be planted in the garden or the pots every year. And that's good to remember that, of course, you don't need to get new bulbs every season. With Narcissus, they're completely perennial and they will flower fantastically next year and for 10 years or even 50 years after that. So you just have to look after your bulbs by either leaving them in the pot or planting them in the garden after they've been in a pot or whatever, but they will just then perennialize. The third one I can talk really quite briefly about because it's remarkable, but it doesn't need a huge explanation. It's called Allium Arctic Snow. And many of you will have heard me talk about Allium schubertii, which is the allium that has got flowers the size of a large football. I mean, I know a football is a football, but it's actually bigger than a football. And it's purple, schubertii. But Arctic Snow is a brand new white version. And Josie had planted this last autumn. And this spring, I went out into the farmhouse garden, which is the pale pastel, soft and cool palette. And there were 4 or 5 of Allium Arctic Snow emerging into flower, end of May, beginning of June, and they're just blow away because somehow they've got that unusual thing of being ghostly and white, particularly in the evening when the light levels are low or in the early morning when I often walk through the garden. And yeah, it just, again, like Narcissus Starlight Sensation, became an absolute must-have for me. And again, like the Narcissus, completely perennial. So we've had Allium schubertii coming up here in a bit that sits quite damp in the garden here for 20 years on the way to the chicken run. I passed them. And it's actually been flooded sometimes because there's a ditch that sometimes gets, the drain sometimes gets blocked. And so that lower part of the garden here actually can flood. And they flooded once, and I thought, oh, that would be the end of the Allium schubertii, but it wasn't. They came back the following year. So really fantastic bulb, the general schubertii, but I think particularly Arctic snow. Number 4 for me is a lily. And I think lilies have gone out of fashion because people are worried about that scarlet lily beetle. But I don't know about you, but I have definitely, and Josie too, have recognized the decline in numbers in the garden here. So we do have lily beetle. It hasn't gone altogether, but we definitely can keep on top of it, in control of it very easily by just squashing them whenever we see them. Anyway, the varieties that are more related to the species seem to resist lily beetle better. So I find things like Lilium henryi, which is very tall, can be 6 or 7 foot, orange with very delicate Turk's cap flowers, but also Black Beauty, which is crimson. And then the other one, Lilium ushida, which is a speciosum rubrum. All those are really, really splendid. But perhaps Black Beauty is my favourite. And I tell you why, because I planted it in a pot in the dappled shade tucked in against the north-facing wall in the Oast Garden when I first made the Oast Garden, and that's 28 years ago. And it's been coming back ever since. And honestly, I haven't done anything to it. It's just brilliant. And so a lot of these species lilies like dappled shade. They're not particularly fragrant. They have a very soft scent, not much, not like the regales, but they are utterly, utterly perennial and will come back year on year and give you this very graceful, elegant beauty all the way through the summer. Number 5 for me is another tulip. Again, really unusual, rather like Dom Pedro. And it's got a very, very unusual colour to it. And it's almost like a verdigris copper pot. You know, when copper gets weathered, it has that rather lovely brown copper into bluey colouring. And Tulip Blue Heaven is a tulip that reminds me so much of that. And it's multi-headed. So rather like Narcissus Starlight Sensation, it gives you cracking value, I think, because you get several heads at the top of every stem. So that, for me, would be my number 5 because it's unusual, because it's got standout. And the longer I go on growing tulips, the more I want my head to be turned. And that would be one in terms of beauty. And Slawa would be my next. So that would be number 6. And that, again, it's just got standout. It's a rich sort of crimson port wine, but going out this lovely soft apricot on the outer petal, the outer edge of the petal. And the thing about it is I've always loved it, but it's Josie who really is passionate about it. And that's why I want to take it to my desert island, because she's shown me quite often when I'm putting together collections, I walk through the garden here and I've picked this, and I've got a really clear picture where I'm going. And then I want just something to jar a bit, not jar in an ugly way, but just to make it sing. And really, quite often, I might go to Josie and say, gosh, what would you put with this to give it standout? And she'd say, try Slawa. And she's almost always right that Slawa, it kind of goes with almost every palette that we grow here. And partly because it's a bicolor, but it just is such a very versatile tulip. And so, for me, that would be my next. And then I would definitely have to go for orange marmalade tulip. Now, this is in functionality. So orange marmalade is unbelievably long flowering. It's one of the viridiflora group. And the viridifloras are not only very long flowering, but also super perennial. And we put this in our rhubarb bed, what must now be 5 years ago, I think. And you'll find quite a lot of tulips if you plant them. They don't necessarily reappear the next year, or certainly 2 years or 3 years later. But orange marmalade, in with our rhubarb, it's in dappled shade, as rhubarb likes, and that has come back stronger and stronger each year. So for me, it's not just that it's really glamorous, really fantastic in the vase, because it's got huge flowers of green and orange together, but also it's just real stalwart reliability. And that would take me to Tulip Sarah Raven, which, again, same kind of thing, really. I discovered that in a bulb field in the Netherlands 10 years ago, I think. And rather like when I saw Tulip Don Pedro this April, when I saw Tulip Sarah Raven, it was torrential rain. I was feeling pretty miserable. I have talked about this before, so I'm sorry if some of you have heard it. I was freezing. I was grumpy. I wanted a cup of tea and probably a bar of chocolate. And I was with my two Dutch friends who I do bulb hunts with quite often, Dickie and Corrine. And we were walking through this field, and I saw in the distance this crimson row, and all the tulips in this field were up for grabs in that if I selected any from there and no one else had already selected and put their cane in, I could then bring them back to the UK and we could breed them out. And that is how we then came to sell Tulip Sarah Raven. But the reason that I love it is it's glamorous, but also it's quite delicate. It's got lovely crimson flowers, pointy tips, and it's very perennial. So that is, again, a really, really reliable one. Tulip Queen's Day would be my next. And again, bit of a story here. So this is planted down the east end of the Oosthuis, and it's in quite a shady border. And we actually have the shuttlecock fern, Machuca strathiopteris, and Phylostachys nigra, the black bamboo. And we grow the black bamboo to make our own bamboo frames around the garden. And we tend to thin it out by 2/3 every other year to give us lots to put into hoops around the garden for staking. So it's quite a sort of dapple shady place down there. And planted through the shuttlecock fern, we have a tulip that genuinely I think I planted 15 years ago, and it's called Queen's Day. And you'll either love it or hate it. It's big, showy, rich red with a little bit of yellow marking. And I'm not overly keen on red and yellow, but I promise you this gold with the red is sensational. But the reason I'm mentioning it is it's a whopper and it is unbelievably perennial. So genuinely still coming up this spring, this April, it was there. Some of them have reverted from being semi-double to actually single as they've aged, but I don't mind that. They're still whoppers and they're still there. And that for me is pretty remarkable. Next is one of the species tulips. So back to my tulip trip in spring when off we went under the Euro tunnel up through France into the Netherlands. And we went right up to the north of Holland to visit a breeder that we tend to visit quite often. And he is a specialist in species tulips. And with the problem with blight in tulips, with our increasingly wet springs, there is a lot of research that tells you that the species tulips seem to have better resistance to blight and the fungal spores. So we wanted particularly to go and have a look in the field scale of 15 or 20 different species tulips. Now, in fact, they're not strictly speaking species tulips anymore because they're actually hybridized. So they have been hybridized from something like a Clusiana, but they're now called botanical tulips. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, were they amazing. So as far as you can see, there was these fields and fields of these very elegant, delicate, beautiful, ethereal, not big chunky hybrid tulips, but really beautiful, delicate things. And Danique was a real show stealer for me. It just in a pot this spring. We already had it on trial, but in the field scale, in grass, wherever I've tried it, it's just outstanding. But I do really call everyone to action on thinking about growing more of the delicate species or botanical varieties, because I think they've got the health and vigor of the wild native tulips. And there's been such wonderful, wonderful breeding recently of them. So I really, really recommend them. 10 and 11 would be a couple of collections, actually. And the first is not a collection in the catalogue. It's made up by me this morning, just thinking through what I might recommend to perhaps one of my children growing in a window box or on a balcony, and wanting something in one pot or one window box that would give you from February to May flowering. And I'm going to plant these, or I'd recommend planting these in a lasagna. And so the latest flowering and largest tulip would go in deepest. And I think for that, I would probably go for Tulip Green Wave or Tulip Green Spirit. And both of them are actually very perennial, but also they're really nice and late. And they're tall, so you can plant them deep and they're still going to perform fabulously. And so they will flower from the middle of April till the middle of May. So one or other of those would be in my deepest layer. Next layer up, which flowers from sort of late March to late April, is Tulip Mystic Van Eyck. And it emerges cream, but as it ages, it sort of goes slightly cafe au lait / with a bit of salmon through it. Very glamorous, very trendy colour at the moment. So that's Tulip Mystic Van Eyck. Next layer up, which flowers from the end of February to the end of March, so helping in the succession, would be Tulip Ice Stick. And that's the first tulip to flower in the garden here. And then finally in the top layer, an Iris reticulata, probably Purple Hill, or doesn't really matter which. And that will flower from the middle of February to the middle of March. So I've got Iris reticulata from the middle of February to the middle of March, Tulip Ice Stick really throughout March, Tulip Mystic Van Eyck from March throughout April, and Tulip Green Wave from April right the way through most of May. So that would be a really lovely combination that I'm going to certainly give as presents, either planted up or sending a container with those bulbs to go in them. And then following on from that, and my final desert island pot would be the March to May combination. And that again is all about succession. And so for the first to flower is Tulip Shogun. And just like the species that I was talking about, this is delicate, it flowers earlier. It's the colour of a kind of almost like a tangerine mixed with a lemon. So it's kind of rather lovely, soft, yellowy orange. And when it first emerges, it's more orange and then it goes more yellow. But it's brilliant in a lasagna or in a succession combination because it flowers very, very early, as a lot of the botanicals do. And then I would move on and I would have two purples, or a crimson, a purple, and an orange. And I would have Cadence for my orange, Sarah Raven, which I talked about earlier, for my crimson, and the lovely Caviar for the purple. But the point with those is that Shogun comes first and flowers throughout March into April. And then you'll find Caviar and Cadence will come, and Sarah Raven, and they will flower well into May. So with the combination of those 4 varieties of bulbs, you'll find you have something pretty splendid for a doorstep, or for the middle of a yard, or for us. The picture in our catalogue is shot in the middle of the perennial cutting garden in a big copper pot, but it really held its own and is truly splendid. So just before I finish, don't forget that if you're going to plant bulbs, particularly tulips, but any bulb, you've got to protect against squirrels. And so I really passionately recommend that you prune your roses in November, you plant your bulbs, and then you put the pruned rose sort of sections of branch with thorns on them horizontally over the top of your pot, and that will keep squirrels and rats at bay. And it works much better in our experience here in our trials than either chicken wire or chili flakes, which are 2 things that we've trialed here. So definitely something thorny, sea hollies or even hollies. But for us, because we've got lots of roses, we prune our roses and we keep the prunings to put over our pots. But also pot toppers are really good at diverting squirrels away from your bulbs underneath. And last year we had great success with a new kale that is luckily enough, nothing to do with me, but luckily enough called Raven. And it's a compact Cavolo Nero that is perfect for planting in pots as soon as you've got your bulbs in the autumn. or one of my very favourite hardy lettuces called ciabatta. So not like the bread, ciabatta, but Cerbiata. Really hardy, lovely crunchy stems, cut and come again. And I was picking that from my doorstep all the way through last winter. And then, of course, if you can get those as seedlings, or of course you can sow your own salad leaves. And salad rocket is completely hardy. Mitsuna, very hardy. Red giant mustard, super hardy, will be happy even in snow, as is giant leaf parsley. So all those are good ideas. And genuinely, in our trials here, we found either the rose thorns or the pot toppers were the two most effective things at keeping any of the rodents from then displacing and digging up all our bulbs. And we have hundreds of pots here, as any of you who've been here will know, and they are all planted up with tulips. And last autumn, we lost none. And 2 autumns before that, we lost lots. And that's why we've experimented with all these ways of diverting the pestilent grey squirrel away from our containers. So the pick of the picks for me would be those. And I hope that was interesting. Don't forget, this week you can make the most of our bulb bonanza, where you get up to 40% off our autumn bulb range. The offer ends this weekend, so you better get your skates on. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.